Hello everyone and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Don John's Ducats by Roger Pilkington. We are now at chapter 7 in Don John's Ducats, which means that we are nearing the conclusion of the story. And so, too, it appears that we are nearing the conclusion of the mystery of the missing gold. When last we met the crew of the Dabchick, they had received another letter from the old pastor in England where Ensign Whittingham lays interred. He had found out from a friend of his that there was a poem that was left behind, ostensibly for the son of Ensign Whittingham, who, we understand, had in his adulthood travelled to the Less to try and find the treasure. So there must be something to it. The poem was very odd, but the crew suspected that it might contain a clue to the location of the gold. They were unable to figure it out at the table, but just as Ensign Whittingham had said, if you study it every night, eventually it will be clear. And so Jill did. It seems that Jill was able to decipher what the meaning of the riddle was, though it still seems a mystery to Michael and Peter, and even to her confidant, Carol. Especially so to me, and so I'm looking forward to finding out what exactly it is that Jill has discovered in the message. Let's find out together, beginning now with chapter 7 of Don John's Ducats. Carol on the line. "Excuse us," said Carol, as she began to scramble up behind Jill, away from where Michael and Peter sat by the camp inside the cave. "We're not going far." "You're certainly not," said Michael with a laugh. "But what's the idea?" "You'll soon see." The two girls clambered over a rock and crouched behind it. Jill looked round the corner and was amused to see Peter and Michael looking so puzzled. "Go on with your lunch," she called. "Never mind us." She drew in her head and spoke in a whisper. "Of course we'll tell them, but let's follow the message right through before we do. It's every third letter. I've counted out the first bit, and it gives ducats." Carol gasped. "Are you sure?" "Of course. Come on, we'll work out the rest. It's a pity we didn't bring in the paper and pencil, as it would have made it much easier." "Never mind," said Carol. "We'll just have to say the lines bit by bit and count them out." So they began, and in whispers they went through the words of the first line. Jill was quite right. Beginning at the second letter, and then taking every third one, the words "adieu, each man stays," gave them ducats, and the whole line provided "ducats lie I." "Ducats lie," Jill said. "Come on, next it's nor has o'er life's abodes an even hand." She herself spelled out 2 letters, and Carol then whispered the third, each time repeating the ones which had come before. In this way they eventually reached the end of the second line. "Ducats lie in hole been N-E-A," Jill announced. "'Tis hence man is but a flower," Carol prompted. "It's my turn next, with T." "I-S," Jill whispered. "H," Carol said. "Neath, that makes beneath." From down below, Peter and Michael could hear no more than an excited flustering behind the rock. "What are you cooking up?" Peter called at last. "Never you mind," Jill answered. "In a couple of minutes we'll tell you." And when at last they had come right to the end of Ensign Whittingham's verse, they scrambled back to the camp circle in such a state of excitement that they could hardly speak. "You tell them," Jill panted. "No, you discovered it," Carol said. "Tell us what, for goodness sake," Peter said. "Oh, nothing," said Jill. "Only just that we know where Don John's gold is." "What?" said Michael, jumping up. "Why not?" said Jill teasingly. "You saw the lines in that letter that came this morning, and you said you were going to repeat them every night. Well, we didn't wait until tonight. We learned them right away. And if you want to know what they say, we'll tell you. At least, we might. But I'm not sure." "Please, please tell us," said Michael impatiently. Jill looked at Carol. "Shall we? Then both together. 1, 2, 3, go. Ducats lie in hole beneath castle walls are, on less." It's every third letter. Michael was dumbfounded. "Why, that's here!" he exclaimed. "Full marks," said Carol. "You're brilliant." "Actually, Walzar is spelt with an S," said Jill. "Probably it used to be written that way, or perhaps he couldn't find a suitable word which had a Z in it." Peter had been too astonished to say anything, but now he spoke. "Well done," he said. "I don't know how you did it." "We wouldn't have if Michael hadn't said ducats," Jill said. "That just gave it away." "We should have worked it out in the end anyway," said Michael, rather envious of their success. "But why sit around talking? For all we know, we're sitting on top of the ducats right here. So let's take candles and have a look. It must mean this hole." "Unless there's another one," Peter said. "Plenty of time to worry about that if we draw a blank here," Michael said. "Come on, everybody. If we have to wait in here anyhow, we might as well spend the time finding the treasure." "If it's still here," said Peter, "a lot can happen in a century or more, and I don't imagine we're the first people to come in here. Still, there's no harm in having a look." Secretly, Jill had 2 special reasons for being glad that they had solved the message of the soldier's poem. In the first place, she was really rather delighted that for once it had actually been she and Carol who had worked out the whole answer, and not Michael. He had a knack of deciphering codes much more quickly, but this time he had had to admit that they had beaten him to it, even though it was he who had given them the lead by talking of ducats. Still, his doing so had been quite accidental, and he couldn't really take any credit for it. But her other reason was that now there was something so intriguing to occupy them inside the cave of Walzar. There was no longer any need for everyone to pretend that they were not really thinking about being shut in by the rising water coming down the river from the heavy rain of the previous night. Of course, they were trapped in the cave just the same, yet there was a difference between being shut in with nothing to do but wait till the water went down, and having something to search for. At least, She told herself that there ought to be a difference, even if it did not make the business of sitting in a cold cavern in a wet swimsuit any warmer. So when Peter suggested that they should carry out a search, she quickly agreed. "I'm sure we can spare the light for a quick look," she said. "We'll have a candle apiece." She dealt them out. "We ought first to make a plan of campaign," said Peter. "There's quite a large amount of the cave to search, and a lot of it is under water at the moment. So it might help if we tried to think where he would have put the stuff." "He must have come in the way we did," Michael said. "You think so?" "Of course. And he could easily have swum for it, because we know that he swam the mews at Namur, all tugged up for the banquet, too." "But he couldn't have got in through the hole, nor out again without ropes and things," Carol said. Said Peter. Jill had an idea. "I wouldn't be so sure," she said. "After all, that's a long time ago to the Battle of Waterloo, and the entrance has probably worn down a bit since then. It might have been easier." Michael seemed doubtful. "More likely he was just lucky, and happened to strike a time when the water was not up to the hole at all. I wouldn't mind betting that if you could look up the weather records for 1815, you would find there was a colossal drought in these parts, so that the hole was exposed high and dry." "I'll tell you something else," Peter said. "If the water is up to the hole, that's because of the weir. Probably the weir was not built in those days, and if the weir was not there, the entrance to the cave would not be down by the water. It would be several feet above it." Jill clapped her hands. "Of course," she said. "That's the answer. The river probably didn't flow in here at all when he hid the gold." "Then he must have put it somewhere where he was fairly sure nobody would find it very easily," Peter said. "After all, somebody might have come exploring in here." "That's true," said Michael. "And that means he wouldn't have been fool enough to leave the bag on the ground just inside the entrance. More likely he buried it under a heap of stones. Come on, let's light up the candles and get going." The 4 flames flickered on the weird stalactites as the crew set about their search of the cave, but it did not take them very long to discover that between their camp and the entrance there were no hiding places at all. Only up among the rocks which had fallen from the roof did there seem to be any possibility that a bag of gold or any other object could remain concealed. And after peering and poking among the stones, they were convinced that nothing was hidden there. "It might be in the bed of the stream," Jill said, somewhat disappointed. "The water is too high for us to see the bottom everywhere, but we can explore bits of it. Peter, you and I will go up towards the entrance and have a really good search." "Right." Michael was about to follow when he felt Carol's hand on his arm. "Come over here," she whispered in his ear. "I want to talk about something." She drew him aside and watched the candles of Jill and Peter bobbing and flickering as they scrambled along the smooth rocks above the edge of the torrent. When she was satisfied that they were too far away to hear her, she began again. "I'm worried," she said. "The water is right over the entrance, and for all we know it may still be rising." "I know," said Michael. "I've been thinking that too. Looking for Ensign Whittingham's bag is all very well, but if it's been here for over a century, it won't disappear in another day or two. What's much more important is that we should get out while we can, or if we can. If it goes on raining, the river may stay high for ages. There's no knowing how long we might be cooped up in here before anybody started to look for us, or guessed what had happened by seeing the dinghy. It's not so bad for an hour or two, but it looks as though we could be here for days, or even for weeks. Our candles won't last forever, and besides that, we haven't much food. Worse still, it's cold, and we haven't any clothing, nothing but our wet swimsuits. She shivered. Well, what shall we do? Michael said thoughtfully. Get out of here. But how? That's the real question, Carol said. I don't mind how, but at least one of us has got to make an escape. I can't think of any way, and that's why I'm asking you. Think hard, Michael. Think. You've just got to have one of your famous brainwaves. Michael was silent for a moment. I'll tell you one thing, he said at last. All that water comes pouring in here, but it runs out just as fast, too. You know how it was rising when we began lunch? Well, it isn't coming up any further. I put a stone for a mark without telling anyone, and the level is just the same. Come here, and I'll show you. He led her down to the water's edge, just near where they had first settled down, and he pointed to a pebble set in one of the rippled rings around the base of a broad and squat stalagmite. You see that? It's just touching the water, and it was like that when you and Jill were solving the clues behind the rocks. Well, that's something, said Carol, tremulously relieved. But if that's right, what about that sort of tide line we saw right up near the ceiling? She lifted her candle and looked at it. That must have been from when the exit got choked up with stuff washed down in the floods, Michael said. And that's just the point. If there's an exit that can get blocked, at least it isn't blocked now, and... He stopped suddenly. I've got it! The days of Waterloo! And as Carol looked at him with such a baffled expression, he put his lips close to her ear and whispered. That's a real brainwave, Carol exclaimed. Do you really think we could? I don't know, but it's worth a try. And anyway, if you can get out and can't manage the rest of the job, you could always fetch help. A stick of dynamite would do the trick. He paused. All the same, I hope you can manage without, because I don't like our having to get help. If we get in a jam, then we ought to be able to get out of it again by ourselves. Hear, hear, said Carol. Come on, we'll have a look and see if it's possible. We won't tell the others what the idea is until we know whether there's any chance of doing it at all. We'll just say we're off to look in the other direction for a bit. She put her hands to her mouth. Peter, she called. Yes? Any luck? No. Michael and I are just looking a little farther in. We shall be back soon. Right you are. Be careful. Yes. Michael climbed quickly back to where the kayak lay drawn up, and he slid it down to the water. Then he handed the painter to Carol and scrambled up to the loose rocks to collect the hammer and the hacksaw and the clothesline. He lit the hurricane lamp again and blew out his candle. Carol extinguished hers too and handed it up to him to put with the other odds and ends ashore. When all was ready, they climbed quietly aboard and let the current carry them, slowly, down the underground watercourse. Carol held the lamp, while Michael knelt in the forepart of the well, fending off with his hands the smooth and glistening stalagmite masses on either side of the drifting kayak. Round a bend to the left, the ceiling came down to within a foot of the water, but lying back in the bottom of their craft, they managed to maneuver it underneath, just scraping the ceiling where a small bunch of stalactites hung from the roof. A few yards farther, the gap widened once more, only to close even more where the water left a slit of no more than a few inches under the rocky vault. The kayak bumped and scraped, then came to a halt. "Provided it doesn't get any lower, we can manage it," said Michael, lying on his back and twisting his knees sideways to keep them clear of the roof. "We must have 6 inches of freeboard on this canoe, and we can drop her a bit lower. Let's tip her a little and ship some water. Then I think she'll float through." He wiggled to one side, and the water began to pour in on top of him. "Not too much," said Carol. "We don't want the thing to founder in here, and we haven't anything to bail with." "She's still well afloat," Michael said as he straightened the kayak again. "Let's see how she goes." He raised his hands and pulled with his palms against the smooth rock, and little by little they bumped forward with the roof just above their faces. Carol held her breath with anxiety, and it seemed minutes before she heard Michael exclaim suddenly, "We're through!" Although it seemed a much longer distance, they had, in fact, to pass only under 4 or 5 yards of the roof before it rose steeply from the water again. Once more they could sit up and look around them. Carol carefully lifted the lamp from between her legs and held it up. In the glow of its flame, they could see that they were now floating on a miniature underground lake, some 10 or 12 feet across. The roof above them was rounded like a dome, but except for the narrow slit through which they had floated into it, there seemed to be no exit. It was as though the stream came to a stop, right inside the cliff. "It's a dead end," Carol said. Michael frowned. "It can't be," he said. "There was a good current carrying us in here, and if all that water is flowing in, it must be flowing out again too. Here, let's have a look round with the lamp." Carol handed it forward to him, but try as they might, they were unable to see any trace of a way out, and only the one low gap through which they had come broke the regular line of the dome where it dropped smoothly down to the water. Nor was there any obvious flow which might have suggested that at some point the roof was only just awash. Michael was decidedly puzzled, and he began to edge the canoe along the wall, examining it as he went. He took the kayak paddle and pushed it down the rock face, but nowhere did there seem to be any break in the surface. They had passed almost round the cavern before he suddenly let out an exclamation. "Look!" He leaned over the side and peered down into the water. Then, sitting back into the kayak again, he placed the light carefully in the bottom of the boat and shaded it. "Take a look," he said. "Right down below us here, there's a patch of light." Carol leaned over and put her face close to the surface. Then she ducked her head in and stayed for a few seconds with the water up to her ears. Pulling herself back, she spluttered and swept her wet hair back from where it hung over her face. "What on earth could it be?" she asked. daylight," said Michael. "Daylight shining through from outside. That's where the water runs out." Carol leaned out and ducked her head again. She stayed under for perhaps half a minute. "That's the exit right enough," she said when she withdrew her head once more. "The wall goes down perhaps 15 feet, and the stream must flow under it and out into the open. The light is shining in brightly enough to light up the stones on the bottom." "That's what I thought. But if it's as far down as that, it's no good to us." "It's certainly a deep dive," Carol said, "particularly when you don't know what's beyond there." She paused. "I think I could try," she said at last. She knew very well that Michael could hardly swim, and for him to try to escape that way was impossible. But he too was thinking. "No," he said, "you can't go down there." Then, suddenly, "I've got it. We'll have to go back first. I think there's something to be done, and then you might have a try." "It won't be too easy getting back," Carol said. "The current will be against us." "Yes, but if we ship some more water, we'll get under that low bit more quickly. And I'll tell you the idea I've had. When we get back, we'll dam the stream near our camp. And if we can hold up the flow, it may drop the level in here just far enough to make all the difference." "Good idea," Carol said. "Let's go." Michael pushed out the kayak, picked up the paddle, and with a couple of quick strokes he turned it and brought the nose up to the mouth of the slit through which they had come. "We'll have to shove with our hands on the roof," he said. "Lie down, and we'll tip more water in if we need to." Carol lay back, and he put his head on her legs, pressing his hands against the roof. The kayak moved an inch or two forwards against the current, bumped on a ridge of the roof, and stopped. "The current is lifting the bows," Michael said. "Let's tip her a little. Not too much. There." He leaned to one side until the water ran over the gunwale. There was a hiss as it surged against the lamp, split the hot glass, and put out the flame. Carol uttered a little cry, and Michael quickly righted the canoe. "Just our luck," he said, trying not to sound alarmed, and then, "Still, there's no need for navigation lights on this river. I don't expect we'll meet much traffic." Carol couldn't help laughing at him. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Carry on upstream." Michael's voice answered from near her knees. "We're afloat again now, and I can feel with my fingers which way the current is coming. We've got to go more to the right. Hands on the roof again. Are you ready? Heave! And again, heave!" "Keep cool," Carol said to herself, her heart thumping horribly. "We've got to get underneath. Keep cool and take it easy. There's nothing to be gained by panicking." She moved her hands forwards, pressed upwards with her palms, and dragged the kayak onwards. "We're doing fine," Michael said. "We're nearly out now." Carol could not suppress a sigh of relief when, at last, she felt with her hands that the ceiling was rising farther away. "We're past the worst," she said. "Yes." Michael sat up very gingerly. "Let's hold her a moment and have a rest. All we have to do after that is to turn a couple of bends, and we shall be back where we started." Soon they set off again, with Michael feeling for the current and Carol kneeling to paddle with her hands. A few minutes passed in the pitch darkness before Michael's head struck something hard. Ow! He rubbed the top of his head with his hand as he ducked down. There's a nasty lump on the roof here. Carol felt the rock close up against the kayak on the right. More to the left, she said, and then, look, you can see the glow on the rock over there. That must be their candle shining round the corner. Well done, Michael. Well done, me, Michael laughed. You've done most of the paddling. Still, it's nice to be home again. If you can call this home. I feel quite like a caveman. As they began to turn the final bend into the main cavern, they called to Peter and Jill, who hurried along the rocks beside the stream and arrived just in time to see the nose of the kayak creeping round from behind the rock face. Good heavens! Peter exclaimed. Where have you been? Michael grinned. Boating, he said. It's like one of those tunnel things at a fair. Still, we found what we're after. There's an exit there. Only it's like the thing at the bottom of a sink. You know, down and then up again. He explained what they had found, then told them his idea. Carol thinks she might be able to get through if we can drop the level. There's a narrow bit just here, and if we can block it enough to stop the flow, she and I will go back and see. I think I could try, said Carol, and if only one of us gets out, then we don't need to worry. You sure it leads out? Peter said. Yes, said Carol. But if it doesn't? Look, said Carol decidedly, if it doesn't, it doesn't. And so I won't go through. But if it does, then I'm going. No arguing, please. I think she should try, Jill said. Peter was still rather doubtful, but he agreed that, at least, it was worth while to try Michael's idea of a dam. They set to work to carry all their belongings to the top of the highest rocks in the gash where the roof had fallen, and then they put their candles on the rocks to give them enough light to begin to collect the material for the dam. It was not very difficult to drag the stones out from where the rubble had fallen from the roof, and they worked in pairs to pull the rough blocks clear and slither them down over the sloping stone to splash into the water at its narrowest point. Peter tested the depth with the paddle and found that it was at least 6 feet deep, but there was no lack of stone to hand, and little by little the bottom of the gully was filled, and the dam grew up towards the surface. A certain amount of water streamed through the crevices, but as soon as the stones were nearly up to the top of the water, the level on the further side began to drop an inch or two. That's fine, Michael exclaimed. It's working. And if we throw a lot of small stones on the upstream side, they'll be carried into the cracks. They kept hard at work, and at last they could see that the water beyond the dam had fallen by nearly a couple of feet, while the level between the dam and the entrance had risen nearly as far. I think we could go now, Carol said, straightening her back. Yes, said Michael. If Jill and Peter keep rising the dam as fast as the water rises, it should go on falling away even further on the other side. Once again, the two of them climbed into the kayak behind the dam, and this time they took the flash lamp, 2 candles, and one of the boxes of matches, which Michael placed in the mug in an effort to keep them dry. They still had not told Peter and Jill the whole of what they had planned. "Be careful," Peter said, "and if you can get out, just go up to the farm near where the van stopped, and tell them to phone the police." "Leave it to me," said Carol. "I will do whatever is necessary." She waved her hand, and Michael pushed off. They had no difficulty now in passing under the low roof without so much as bending down, and when at one point the canoe ground on the gravel bottom, Michael realized that the level must have fallen as far as they could expect it to. Arrived once more at the little cavern under its domed ceiling, they were somewhat surprised to see that the daylight did not shine more brightly on the bottom, where the stream flowed out under the deep ledge. Indeed, it was not visible at all. "That's odd," Carol said. "I'm sure this is the right spot, but there's nothing to be seen." She shone the flash down through the water, and could see where it was that the wall of the cave gave way to a cavity a few feet below the surface. "I can see the exit quite plainly," she said. "It's there, but the light has gone." Michael suddenly laughed. "You know why the light has gone? Because it's dusk. We've been in the cave for hours and hours." Carol swept the underwater wall with the torch. "Light or dark, I'm going to have a try," she said. She tied one end of the clothesline in a loop around her wrist and arranged a code of signals with Michael. If she pulled with a single jerk, it meant that he was to haul in the line slowly but firmly to guide her back again. 2 jerks would mean that she had found her way through and had come up on the other side. 3 meant that he was to drop the other end of the line to the bottom, with the hacksaw and hammer attached, so that she could pull them through. "Michael!" Peter's voice came to them, carried through the cave behind them. "Yes," Michael called. "We can't hold it much longer. We are nearly under water." "Hold on! 2 minutes!" Michael yelled back. He quickly tied the saw and hammer to the line. "Are you ready, Carol?" She climbed over the edge of the kayak into the water. "All set," she said, trying not to betray her misgivings. And here again we have another drawing of that very moment, as Carol slips into the dark water, the clothesline firmly attached to her wrist. What exactly they have planned I do not know, but we'll find out in just a moment, I'm sure. "Best of luck," said Michael, "and if you can't make it, I'll haul you back. I shall watch for the signal." Carol smiled, waved a hand, put her head below the surface, and kicked up her legs. As her feet vanished, the line ran quickly over the side of the canoe. Michael let it glide through his hand so that he could feel if any signal should come up to him. "Thank goodness it's at least warm in the water," Carol thought to herself as she duck-dived downwards, kicking her legs in powerful strokes and keeping her hands stretched ahead of her. Down and down she went in the dark until her fingers plunged into something soft. "Must be the bottom," she thought. "If only I haven't turned round." She crawled forward, a hand in front of her face, and after a few seconds let herself rise a little. A gentle bump on her back told her that she was not yet through to the other side, and she turned over to push with her legs on the ceiling. A few seconds more, and her shoulder came violently up against the rock. Twisting her arms ahead of her, she could feel a hole, no more than a couple of feet across. "Can I last out?" she wondered. "I've still breath to get back if I signal Michael to pull, but—" Her heart was beating fast, and her lungs felt very tight. One more wriggle forward, or perhaps two, and if she could not feel the end of the hole, she would have to jerk the cord and be hauled to safety in the cave again. "Must signal while there's time," she thought. "Must signal, but not yet." There was no room to kick out now, for the wall seemed very close around her. 5 seconds more at the most, she said to herself. 4, 3, 2. She was just gathering the line into her other hand to jerk it hard, when suddenly she felt herself swept irresistibly forwards. She struck her elbow hard, then her thigh, then the middle of her back. There was a roaring in her ears, and she felt as though she were choking. But all at once she found herself rising fast, and she felt the pressure on her lungs decreasing. Desperately she held her breath, and a moment later her head broke through the surface. Without opening her eyes, she let out her breath and took another. It was wonderful to be in the air again. She gasped another gulp of air and felt a gentle pattering on her face. Treading water, she opened her eyes. "Rain!" she blurted out aloud in her astonishment. "Rain!" And peering above her, she made out the forms of the dark clouds speeding across the twilight sky. She took hold of the stones in front of her and drew herself to her knees. Then she stretched her arms out into the air, which seemed so warm after the cool damp within the cave. Back in the cavern, Michael had counted to himself from the moment she disappeared, resolved that he would, in any case, haul in the line when he had counted up to 40, even if Carol had not then signalled. But he had got no further than 8 when he heard a warning shout from Peter, followed by a dull, echoing roar, and he knew what had happened. Under the pressure of the rising water, the dam had collapsed. He quickly pushed the kayak out from the wall, and with the line still trickling through one hand, he held up the flash lamp and turned it towards the passage through which he had entered. The roaring grew louder, and just as he had counted up to 25, the massive wall of water surged round the corner. At once the cavern seemed to fill, and Michael steadied himself as the kayak rocked and twisted on the waves which rebounded from the walls and slopped up and down in the centre. Quickly the level rose with the inrush of the penned-up water, and it seemed almost as though the kayak would be lifted right to the ceiling. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, he felt the water falling, and in the beam of the flash he saw the vortex of a whirlpool right in the centre of the chamber. Round and round it spun, a whirling, gurgling funnel, and at the same instant the line began to race out through his fingers, yard upon yard. Unknown to him, the violent filling of the cavern and its sudden flushing through the underwater exit had come to Carol's assistance, just in the nick of time, and had washed her powerfully through the tunnel and up to the open air above. Rocked hither and thither in the canoe, Michael was fearful for what might be happening to her down below, but he had no time to pull in the line before he felt it jerk. Once, twice, and a third time the signal came. "Well done," he gasped. He picked up the hammer and saw and dropped them over the edge. "I knew you'd do it, Carol," he said, just as though she were there to hear him. "Now for the rest of your work." He turned off the flash and settled down in the dark to wait until the rush of water had subsided. That is the end of Chapter 7, and what an exciting end. As someone who is an avid swimmer and loves the water, even for me that would be a little harrowing to have to hold one's breath for so long. I'm glad that Carol made it through, though I wonder what she and Michael have planned. I guess we'll have to wait until next time on Soft Stories to find out together. Until then, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.